Love, you idiot, Max muttered, his palm landing sharply on the back of his friend's head, the sound dry and deliberate, as if he were trying to knock some sense into him. James flinched, pushing him away with his shoulder and frowning, rubbing the spot more from discomfort at being called out than from any real pain. Beneath that defensive gesture, something restless stirred, a quiet unease he had been trying to smother for days, though he would rather die than admit it aloud. He could feel himself sinking, slowly and irreversibly, into something that felt like love. Not the light, fleeting kind born from a smile or a kind word, but the deeper, aching kind, the one that hurt because it was real. The kind where another's presence became a refuge, where silence with them was worth more than conversation, where vulnerability didn't repel, but drew you closer, because in it you saw your own reflection. He wondered if he had truly believed that friendship would be enough, when his heart was already inching dangerously close to confession. Fear pressed against his ribs, but within it was a strange comfort, the quiet realization that despite everything, despite the years and the scars, he was still capable of loving this deeply, this nakedly. It was a warm whisper in a world that had long ago taught him to bury his feelings, to hide them beneath cynicism and control. "I haven't told her yet," he muttered, his voice low, unguarded in a way he hadn't intended. "But that doesn't mean I don't think about it." The words weren't meant for Max, or for anyone, really. They were an admission to himself, a quiet plea from a man terrified of his own truth. Max studied him for a long moment, then simply nodded, lowering his gaze, as if he didn't want to let his eyes reveal how much he already knew. "What's that look for?" James broke the silence, his tone edged with discomfort, the kind that appears when you realize someone sees you too clearly. "You're looking at me like you don't believe me." "What look?" Max tried, half-heartedly, but his eyes betrayed him. Eyes always did when truth had already taken root behind them. "You know exactly what I mean. That look, like you think I'm lying." James sighed, feeling his patience slipping. "And what about you? Have you told Caroline?" Max hesitated for a second, then shrugged and spoke quietly, without evasion. "No, but she hasn't told me she loves me either. We're taking it slow. She's still healing, and I won't force her wounds to close faster than they're ready. But I know what I feel." "So do I," James snapped, his voice sharper than he intended, betrayed by his own helplessness. "I just told you I've been thinking about it." Max's silence was heavy, not the neutral kind, but the kind that carried weight, the silence of someone who saw more than he wished to. His gaze darkened, shadowed by memory, as if a picture neither of them wanted to recall hovered just between them. "I've seen you," he said finally, his voice quiet but cutting through the air like a blade. "I've seen you hanging around Anya's bookshop in London, even when it's closed, even when she's not there." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. James turned sharply, eyes flashing, heart pounding not from guilt but from anger, the raw kind that comes when someone starts peeling away layers you fought to keep hidden. "You followed me?" His voice was cold, almost dangerous. "Were you spying on me?" "I didn't follow you," Max replied, standing firm, his tone steady, unshaken. "But I'm not blind, and I'm not stupid. I know what you look like when you're trying to suppress something." James's jaw tightened. In his mind, two names collided, two faces. Elizabeth, with her quiet frown, her trust, her steady gaze that always demanded too much. And Anya, the ghost that never faded, the scent that lingered in his memory like something that refused to wash out, no matter how many times you tried. "Elizabeth knows we talked," he said defiantly, more to convince himself than Max. "I told her. She wasn't thrilled." "Yet you keep going there," Max said, unflinching, "even when you know she won't be there. You're not going for the coffee." James stared at him, disbelief tightening every muscle in his body. "So what are you saying? That I'm having an affair with Anya? That I'm cheating on Elizabeth?" "I don't know, James," Max said quietly, though his words carried the weight of truth he couldn't soften. "All I know is that you're drawn to her again, and we both know what that story was like." Silence fell between them, thick, suffocating, heavier than explanation. Max had spoken aloud, what James had spent years burying, and now that truth lay between them like a stone they could no longer step over. "So what?" James growled, his anger giving him a strength that wasn't real. "Does that mean I'm not allowed to talk to anyone but my wife? Does that make me guilty by default?" "You know that's not what I mean," Max said, his voice low but unwavering. "I just don't want Elizabeth to get hurt again, especially not after everything, after what happened with you and her little sister." Something inside him cracked, anger, shame, and helplessness colliding in a violent rush that almost stole his breath. His fist clenched until his knuckles went white, and the words escaped through his teeth like venom. Stay out of my damn life, Max. You're not my conscience. He turned abruptly, storming away, furious, wounded, and lost. Max remained still, pinned by the echo of his words, trapped in the quiet knowledge that he couldn't stop him. James's heart pounded wildly as he strode down the path, realizing that Max hadn't accused him. He had simply forced him to face a mirror he wanted to shatter. Anya. She wasn't just the past. She was the wound that had never healed, the feeling that had never faded, and the shadow that refused to die. He got into his car in one harsh motion, as if the cold metal could somehow shield him from his own thoughts. The seatbelt jammed, and he cursed aloud, slamming his hand against the dashboard, furious, not at the belt, but at himself. He hit the gas, tearing out of the garage with a surge of speed that felt almost like release. Rage and longing filled the space around him, along with one question that refused to quiet, the one he was too afraid to speak. Had he ever really stopped loving Anya? The road unfolded before him, familiar and inevitable. He didn't even try to turn. The path, as it always did, led straight to her. Fields blurred into gray concrete, and the sky hung low and dim. 11:55, almost noon. Still, his foot pressed harder on the pedal. He didn't know what he would say when he arrived. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But he needed to see her, because in a world where everyone either spoke too much or not enough, the only conversation he could still bear to have was with her.
James stood before the shop window, like a man who had wrestled with himself for far too long, his own body now foreign to him, unsure whether to remain rooted to this spot or take that single step forward. His fist was clenched to the point of pain, as though in it he had gathered everything that had been building up for years, with nowhere left to go. The door of the bookshop was left slightly ajar, just enough for the air of presence to slip through, and inside, the soft scrape of paper and the faint tapping of fingers against wood echoed like the ticking of a clock in a house that already knew its own time. When he finally stepped inside, the bell above the door chimed in a thin, fragile tone, as if surprised by his arrival. In that brief moment, the room ceased to be just a quiet space filled with books. It became an arena for a meeting long avoided, yet inevitable. Anya looked up from the counter, and her almost smile, just the faintest flicker that began to form on her lips, trembled and disappeared before it ever became real. It was not a smile of welcome, nor of hostility, but the look of a woman suddenly faced with a ghost she had never wanted to see again, yet could not banish from sight. Her hands, resting on the edge of the counter, seemed detached from her body, caught between the impulse to reach for him and the urge to push him away. He stood silent, too large for that stillness, awkward and exposed, while the scent of lavender and old pages hovered like a witness, recording every thought colliding between them. "Hi," he said hoarsely, his voice carrying the unease of someone unused to speaking, afraid of how it might sound. "Sorry, It's fine," she interrupted quickly, almost too quickly, as if speed was the only way to maintain distance. "You just startled me." He tried to form a smile, but it faltered halfway, crooked, unfinished, like a letter left unsent. His gaze wandered slowly over the shelves, over the chairs that still remembered a time when they were new, over the mug with a faint ring of coffee on the table. Everything in that room was neat, calm, rhythmical in a way that belonged entirely to her. It was clear he did not belong to that piece, yet he didn't know how to leave. "I didn't know where else to go," he admitted quietly, lowering his eyes for the first time that day, like a man confessing defeat, not to another, but to himself. "You shouldn't be here," she said, calm but straining to keep her voice steady. "I know," he replied simply, and that word, instead of ending the conversation, opened a hollow where the past began to breathe. She didn't offer him a seat. She didn't reach for coffee. She made no attempt to create false warmth. She only looked at him the way someone does when they've built their silence brick by brick, only to feel the ground trembling beneath it. "I don't know what you're looking for, James." "Maybe I'm not looking for anything," he said slowly, without urgency, like someone feeling his way through darkness. "Maybe I'm just trying to understand why I still dream of you, why your voice keeps coming back." Her words were clear, sharp, but beneath them flickered the faint glow of uncertainty. "And you think I can give you those answers? You're Elizabeth's husband, the father of 2 girls. Your life is somewhere else. Maybe this is just guilt, not love." He listened like a man who knew there was no excuse left to offer, yet still dared to stand there. "Maybe it is, or maybe it isn't. But still, I needed to see you." Her breath came shallow, uneven. She wanted to tell him to leave, to shut the door again, to let her return to the rhythm of a day she understood, to a world where every page and every silence had its place. But she didn't move. His presence was too familiar to erase so easily. "Don't come here again," she said at last, her voice not harsh, but heavy, like a stone dropped into a river. "I don't want her past finding me here." He didn't protest, didn't try to persuade her. He only nodded and turned to go, pausing at the doorway, his hand still resting on the handle, like a man holding on to the last remnant of something lost. "You deserve to know," he said softly, voice fading, "that I never forgot you, and that I miss you. Not as a demand, not as hope, but as an absence that never left me, Anya." The door closed behind him, and the bell above it trembled for a while longer, as if it too refused to let his leaving pass unnoticed. The room was silent again, but it was no longer the silence of peace. It was the silence that echoes with absence. Anya motionless, the book slipping from her hands and falling to the floor. She didn't bend to pick it up. In her chest, something long buried began to stir again, a heart finding its old rhythm. Memory stood before her, not only in his shape, but in every scent, in every word he had spoken, when he called her name simply, without endearment, just Anya. She wrapped her arms around herself, seeking refuge in her own embrace, fighting to close the door he had opened without meaning to. She stepped into the small space behind the shelves and sat on the couch, lowering her forehead onto her hands. Above her, on the shelf, lay Kai's drawing of her, her mother, and a dog they had never owned, but had invented together. She looked at the paper as if it held the whole truth. This was the present. This was home. This was love. Yet the heart, stubborn and blind, didn't always know how to choose between what was right and what was real. For a moment, she let the thought escape, let her release from its cage. What if he had stayed? What if they had talked longer? What if nothing had been too late? Then she opened her eyes sharply, as if waking from a dream, and returned to the shop. She picked up the fallen book and placed it back on the shelf, with a firm motion, though her hands were trembling. Still, in the corner where he had stood, something of him lingered, not the scent of his cologne, not anything tangible, but a trace of presence that clung to the air and refused to fade. Anya opened the door and let the wind in, letting it scatter the heaviness that had gathered in the room. She didn't do it for him. She did it for herself. Night descended over the city quietly, inevitably, wrapping the streets in a darkness that was more than the absence of light. The glow from shop windows shimmered across the puddles left by the day's earlier rain, and the shadows of passers-by stretched long and thin, unreal, as if they belonged to another world. James drove without hurry, his hand still on the wheel, his thoughts roaming freely, returning again and again to Anya's words. Those words, short and precise, had carved themselves beneath his skin. He repeated them to himself like a man trying to escape a scent that haunted him, knowing full well he never would. When the house appeared before him, that stone villa where he had spent so many years, he felt both warmth and weight. It lay beneath the moonlight in perfect stillness, wrapped in the dark silhouettes of pine trees standing guard around it. Through the living room window spilled a soft yellow light. The car rolled to a stop along the gravel drive with the muted crunch of stones, and when the engine fell silent, the stillness that followed seemed almost tangible. For a moment, he remained in the car, watching the window, imagining Elizabeth inside, perhaps with a book in her hands, perhaps with a glass of wine, perhaps simply sitting in the quiet that had long been both her companion and her refuge. When he stepped out, the air was sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. The cold night breeze carried a strange kind of relief, as if it could cleanse what had gathered heavy inside his chest. He entered the house almost hesitantly. The hallway greeted him in a soft half-light, illuminated only by the lamp on the table. The sound of his shoes against the floor was the only thing that disturbed the calm. Then he saw her, Elizabeth, sitting on the sofa, wrapped in a gray wool blanket, a book resting in her lap. She lifted her gaze to him, saying nothing at first. Her expression was quiet, almost still, but her eyes spoke more than any voice could. "You're late," she said, not sharply, not accusingly, but with a gentleness that sounded more like acknowledgement than judgment. "I know," he answered, setting down his coat and taking a seat across from her. His words lagged behind his thoughts, as if each one had to fight its way through the weight pressing against his throat. For a while he sat in silence, feeling his thoughts wrestle, searching for shape, until he finally spoke what he knew he could no longer keep hidden. "I went to see Anya." The
The words were plain, unembellished, without defense or excuse, as if confession itself was enough. Elizabeth lowered her gaze to the book, but didn't close it. When she spoke, her voice came slow and measured, carrying the gravity of truths long carried in silence. "You know," she said, "when someone isn't fully here, when you see their thoughts drifting away, when the smile never quite reaches the eyes, you don't need an explanation. The body always speaks before words." James dropped his gaze, his hands clasped together like a man in prayer, feeling small, powerless, like a child standing before something he cannot name, let alone admit. "Nothing happened," he whispered, "but I had to let go of what was pressing against me. I kept dreaming of her, her face, her words. They were suffocating me. I had to understand why." "And did you?" she asked, her voice both distant and close, as if she was calling him and letting him come on his own. He lifted his head and nodded softly. "I think I did. It was guilt, sadness maybe, regret for the choices I made, for what I lost or wasted, but not love, not anymore." She watched him for a long time without speaking, then rose from the sofa and walked toward him slowly, steadily. She laid her hand on his shoulder, and in that touch there was neither doubt nor accusation. It was the touch of a woman who had found strength even when none was left, a hand that had learned not to demand explanations, but to offer a path back to peace. "She isn't here," Elizabeth said quietly. "I am. Your daughters are. Your home is here. If you know that, then maybe we still have somewhere to go." James covered her hand with his, feeling the warmth seep beneath his skin like a fire that didn't burn, but gave back light. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the weight pressing on him, only the fragile certainty that something was guiding him home. "I know," he said, and the words weren't empty. They were truth. Elizabeth leaned in, and he lowered himself down for her, then kissed his forehead. Her voice came soft, a whisper before a new beginning. "Come, we'll need strength for the morning." He followed her, leaving behind the hallway, still steeped in the quiet of night. What he had been, what he had carried, dreams, memories, all that once haunted him, remained behind, sealed off like the door of an old bookshop that no longer needed to be anyone's refuge.